everyone, this is Ocean. So, for my creative writing project, I wrote a short story titled Under the Stage Lights. At its core, it isn't just about public speaking, even though that is the event that takes place in the story. It's an exploration of anxiety as a physical reality for the main character. I wanted to capture how it feels when your environment seems to in, conspire against you and how a support system can be the bridge that pulls you back. So to begin and kind of give you all an understanding of what my story was, I want to start by giving a little insight into Arden, my main character. So Arden views his life through a strict binary. As a writer, he finds safety in structure, predictability, and behind-the-scenes control, whereas as the speaker, he feels represents a terrifying public gaze. He believes he is the one who creates the words, but he shouldn't be the one who actually delivers them. So the story is the friction between who he thinks he is and who he is actually capable of becoming. To drive this conflict, I used what is known as a ticking clock structure or narrative. There is the setup, which is a talented but deeply anxious teen writer delegates his speech to his best friend in order for him to avoid the public gaze and to not give it himself. This is more towards 9 a.m., where he has a predictable plan. But the twist happens just moments before the ceremony when Amber, the friend who was supposed to give the speech, vanishes. Suddenly, a low-stakes school event becomes a high-pressure countdown, leaving Arden with no escape but the stage itself. Arden uses being the one to write the speech as a way to hide behind the words. He thinks that being the writer has this external mask to the public. He's where he's gonna come across as hyper competent, organized, helpful, and quiet. He thrives in structured environments, like when they're setting up for the awards ceremony and he has a checklist of all these items he has to do, and he's trusted by adults and peers alike. Whereas, while those are true, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. So his internal reality is he's overwhelmed, hyper observant, and terrified of public perception. The reason he doesn't want to give the speech comes from a fear, and it's not a fear because he lacks the speaking ability. He's an excellent presenter. It's rather an acute fear of external judgment and how he's afraid he'll be perceived as incompetent or incapable if he fails or messes up in any way. When I was writing my story, I wanted to be able to show, not tell, Arden's panic. So in the story, for Arden, the world becomes like an audio overload, with the marching band drums rattling against his ribs, or the stage lights being too bright in the wrong shade of white. To survive, Arden uses different grounding rituals. So there's the scent of sandalwood from his laundry detergent still clinging to his clothes, or the cold industrial soap in the locker room that the school uses, and he uses these scents to kind of tether himself to reality. He also uses tactile grounding, where he aligns scattered pencils across his desk perfectly in straight lines, or runs icy water from the locker room over his hands while counting or smoothing out his t-shirt or straightening his tie. To go a little bit more in depth into the type of grounding behaviors that Arden uses in the story, I wanted to start with these all occur during the locker room scene, and I'm going to kind of go through them in order. So we have temperature shock, which he uses running his hands under the icy water at the sink to wash away stickiness from whatever he had been doing in the setup for the when he was setting up for the awards ceremony. And while he's like washing his hands, the temperature is also paired with the sharp scent of industrial soap, and that kind of like calms his nervous system. And while he's washing his hands, he uses rhythmic logic for counting to count each scrubbing motion in his head until his breathing finally slows. He also uses sartorial order, and sartorial just means like related to tailored clothing. And he does this by soothing invisible wrinkles on a maroon shirt and sliding the gray tie upward until it sits perfectly centered. In my story, I gave two kind of what I call support systems to the main character. The first one has more of a steady foundation in his life, and this is going to be his dad, Dr. Grover. He represents more of preventative care. He builds a like rational foundation for Arden's confidence. In the story's climax, seeing his father's face standing tall and steady in the crowd becomes the primary emotional anchor Arden needs to keep his voice from shaking. He also researches and utilizes natural remedies to try and lower Arden's anxiety, like hiding nutmeg and cardamom in breakfast bacon. He also uses vocal affirmation to remind Arden of past successes, like when he spoke on the Young Leaders of America panel or gave a speech at the governor's house party to try and build up Arden's confidence. The next support system that I have in the story is going to be Amber. This is his Arden's best friend, and she's more of like the silent safety net type of support system. How I introduce Amber into the story is kind of having Arden give a memory from when he was in second grade, hiding under a bench at recess with his hands pressed into his ears, trying to block out the loud chaos and sounds of all his other classmates that was ensuing around him. And Amber found him, and unlike other teachers or classmates who had made fun of him or tried to pull him out, she just sat with him and quietly read one of her Junie B. Jones books, quietly letting him be without ever letting him be alone. There is a historical trust between them where she served as his voice when he couldn't speak, and his sudden disappearance, when she disappears from giving this speech, even more devastating for Arden. However, it's this deep foundation of trust that allows her to take the massive risk for Arden's sake. I mentioned earlier how in my story I wanted to be able to show, not tell Arden's panic. So here I'm going to go a little bit deeper into kind of how I express that to the reader without being like, oh, he's panicked. So for Arden, one of the things he experiences is vertigo, and that happens with the sensation of the hallway slowly tilting underneath his feet and an overwhelming lightheadedness he gets right before he has to go out to give the speech. There's also tachycardia, where he has his hammering pulse beating like the band's drum with each beat pressing harder into his chest. This happens through multiple parts in the story. There's also constriction, where his lungs are tightening within the ribcage in strange, uneven bursts as the pressure mounts when he's having to actually give the speech. Like this is happening during the speech. And there's also tremors, where he has a white-knuckled grip onto the lectern and it's ice cold, and it's just the physical state of emergency for him in that part. I mentioned earlier how I used a ticking clock narrative to drive the plot of the story and drive the conflict of the story. And I want to go a little bit more into what happens throughout my story. So I know my slide starts with 9 a.m. The story starts before 9 a.m. 9 a.m. is when he gets to the school, but I have stuff that occurs beforehand. And before that, it's kind of where I have setup and foreshadowing. And it's mostly just him at home getting ready for the day, organizing things in his room, and going down to eat breakfast with his dad. And he talks with his dad, and this is when the dad's giving him like encouragement, like, I really think you should be the one to give the speech tonight. You know you would do well. You presented at these other things and done great. Arden explains that he's the writer, not the speaker, because that's what he believes. And they go and they get in the car on the way to school. Once they're at the school is at 9 a.m. and from 9 a.m. to late afternoon is when they're setting up for the awards ceremony, because Arden is one of the students on the planning committee for this end of year award ceremony at his school. And Amber, the friend who's also going to give the speech, she's also one of the members on this committee. So one, they're doing setting up their hanging banners, arranging chairs, making sure the light system's working, double checking the sound system. And he has a checklist of all the things he's supposed to do. And all of these structured tasks make the day feel really predictable and calm, and he feels really safe in what's happening. Later in the afternoon, Amber asks Arden to help her run through her speech, and Arden thinks it's just to help make sure she's as prepared as she can be, but in reality, her motive behind it is to make sure that he's going to be prepared when he has to give the speech later on, but he doesn't know that yet. So they run through the speech 4 times, and Arden kind of uses his phone's flashlight to imitate what the stage light would do during the real performance, and he helps her run through all of the cues and everything, and this is just really where she's seeing that like he's capable to give the speech later in the day. So once they're finished going through their run-throughs, she goes back to be with the rest of the committee, and he goes to the bathroom. This is going to be at 5:56. And earlier when I mentioned him grounding himself in the bathroom with the sink and the counting and the tactile with his clothes, that's all happening here. And then at 5:58, he hears the band start going, and he realizes that he needs to return back to be with the committee because Amber's going to go on stage soon and he wants to be able to support her by watching. So once he gets out in the hallway, he sees the committee standing together and they're talking really urgently but hushed, and he can tell something's wrong. Like they're panicking, but he doesn't know what. So he goes over, and this is when he finds out that Amber is missing. Nobody knows where she is. She's not answering her phone. And this is when the panic really sets in because the band's already playing, so somebody is going to have to be giving the presentation soon, but if Amber's not there, who's it going to be? He really doesn't want to be the one to give it. But the teachers and the other classmates explain to him that he's the one who wrote the speech, so he knows it better than everybody else. And they saw him practicing with Amber earlier, and he knows everything about how it's supposed to go and occur, so he's really their only option. At 6 o'clock is when he agrees to go on. Shortly after, the band finishes performing, and he is pushed on stage by the teacher, one of his teachers, who is the committee leader. And he's on the stage, and time kind of slows down for him as he's taking in all of the sensory, all of the everything that's happening around him in the auditorium. He's taking in, and the time really slows down in this part right before he goes to give the speech. During that time, when right before he goes to give this speech, he really experiences a sensory overload. So at the stage, at the lectern, this is when it kind of peaks for him. There's the smell of the popcorn and the roar of the crowd, the blinding lights, or the feeling of the ice cold lectern in his hands, but then he shifts. Arden squeezes his eyes shut and grips the lectern, that physical touch allowing him to move from survival mode to performance mode. The words finally begin to flow out of his mouth, but while he's giving the speech, he's not really aware of what's happening. He kind of goes into a autopilot state since he already has the speech memorized. He's not reading from the script, but he's giving it memorized, but he's not actively aware of the words coming out of his mouth. So it isn't until later that he's able to focus on how his performance was. Once he's finished giving the speech, he returns back to be with the rest of the committee members outside of the gym, and he's met with overwhelming amount of congratulations from them, and they all give him a big group hug. They all slowly let go one by one until there's just one person still hugging Arden. Confused, he looks down and he sees that it's Amber. In this moment is when he realizes that Amber is back, and he's confused because she disappeared and now speech is over and she's back, and this is when she reveals that her disappearance was on purpose. She knew Arden was hiding behind his words and that he needed to be forced to step into them. Her note, "You've got this," on the top of the script shows she believed in his voice even when he didn't. It was an act of tough love designed to prove his own strength to him. In the story, the victory here isn't a perfect speech. It's the fact that Arden stayed. When he watches the recording later, he hears a voice, his voice, that is steady, confident, and warm. He tells Amber, "I didn't run this time," because in the past, every time he would give a speech at school, he would end up running to the nurse's office. He realizes that he can coexist with his anxiety rather than being consumed by it. In conclusion, ultimately Under the Stage Lights is about redefining bravery for Arden. He realizes that bravery isn't an absence of fear or the perfect execution of a speech or the elimination of anxiety. It's the willingness to say yes to something terrifying, knowing you're anchored by the people who believed in your voice before you were brave enough to even use it, and it's about staying long enough to prove to yourself that you are capable. Arden found his voice because he finally allowed himself to be seen, and that's kind of, for me, that's my main takeaway from the story. Thank you for listening.